After Tischendorf revealed his Codex Sinaiticus, he was hailed as a great scholar and greeted with laudation across Europe.
Oh, cheers! My good friend.
But shortly after the work was published, it was challenged by a prominent expert in paleography. His name was Konstantin Simonides.
Konstantin Simonides is undoubtedly the forgotten link in the history of Codex Sinaiticus, and it's because he waged an open and a public debate against Tischendorf for about 4 years, arguing that Codex Sinaiticus was not an ancient manuscript. And the more you study Simonides, you realize that he was a very important figure at that time.
Alexander von Humboldt declared that Simonides was an enigma. Others believed his understanding of ancient languages to be ingenious. A 19th century publication said of him, "Dr. Simonides is a Greek by birth, and he speaks and writes the classic language of his forefathers with fluency, purity, and elegance." From his uncle, Simonides thoroughly acquired the art of paleography and became so great a proficient therein that few surpass him either in the practice of it or in the diagnosis of manuscripts.
Simonides had quite a reputation in the 19th century. On the one hand, he was a respected paleographer, but on the other hand, he had kind of a cloak and dagger history and was looked upon as sort of a Greek Indiana Jones, involved not only with ancient manuscripts, but also fighting battles as a Greek patriot against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which is an important part of understanding who he was.
Come, my brothers, we shall avenge the blood of our fathers on this Turkish invader. Let us be strong in our weakness, and with God's help we shall prevail.
One of the newspapers of the time reported that the escapades of Mr. Simonides extend over nearly 20 years. In Alexandria, he contrived to quarrel with some Arabs, pistoled 2 of them, received some ugly wounds on the head and face from a third. In Macedonia, his native country, he succeeded in getting up a little insurrection among his countrymen, who joined him in the leadership of the patriot bands. He fell on a detachment of Turkish soldiers, drove them into a river, and destroyed some 150 of them.
These are the kinds of stories recorded about Simonides as a Greek patriot, who was still fighting against the Turks in a conflict that dated all the way back to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. When the Turks invaded the ancient capital of the Greek Orthodox Empire. In the 19th century, the Greeks remembered Constantinople as if it had just happened the day before.
Constantinople will be ours again!
Simonides was apparently involved in continued battles with the Turks and controversies against the Latinizers, or Roman Catholics as he called them, because both the Turks and the Catholic Church had fought against the Greek Orthodox kingdom. And so for Simonides, the Turks and the Catholics were both ancient enemies. And this conflict with Rome in particular would have everything to do with his controversy against Tischendorf. And then as a scholar, Simonides was equally in the thick of debates about ancient manuscripts. He had presented his work before kings, nobles, foreign ministers, diplomats. He'd sold a number of manuscripts to the British Museum and other prominent institutions in Europe. So he was involved in the highest levels of the academic world at that time.
Simonides owned a collection of more than 5,000 ancient manuscripts that he had partly inherited from his uncle. As he traveled across Europe, he presented these works at libraries and universities. Their content often sparked intense debate. Simonides' debates usually centered around the understanding of ancient languages, and he generally believed that his own knowledge was superior to those around him, although he did not have a reputation for arrogance. While he was in Germany, he got into a vicious conflict with the scholars at the University of Leipzig, and it was there in 1855 that he made enemies with von Tischendorf. So now, years later, when he comes forward and questions Codex Sinaiticus, he does so as Tischendorf's old nemesis. Simonides claimed that Codex Sinaiticus was no ancient manuscript at all, but a modern work created by himself and two other Greeks in 1840. While Tischendorf was in the midst of enjoying his fame, the story of Simonides began to be published in the London newspapers.
Simonides?
Needless to say, Tischendorf was furious.
Schweinhund! Idiot!
What followed would be a public debate that would continue in a variety of London newspapers for the next 2 years. In July of 1861, a publication called the Literary Gazette reported that, "We understand that in literary circles a rumor prevails that the manuscript now publishing by the Russian government under the direction of Mr. Tischendorf, purporting to be a manuscript Bible of the 4th century, is not an ancient manuscript, but is an entirely modern production, written by a gentleman now alive, who will shortly take measures to establish his claim to the authorship. The manuscript is known as the Codex Sinaiticus and has attracted a large amount of attention throughout Europe. Should the rumor prove to be correct, as we believe it will, the disclosures that will follow must be of the greatest interest to archaeology."
In his letters, Simonides says that the controversy began over Codex Sinaiticus when he first saw the manuscript in Liverpool in 1860, and then it was the following year that the newspapers got hold of the story. So this story first appears in 1861, but Simonides did not publish his side of the story until 1862, and the only reason he did so is because he was drawn in to the conflict by two of the prominent scholars at that time.
The two scholars in question were Samuel P. Tregelles and Fenton John Anthony Hort. Tregelles and Hort believed Sinaiticus to be real and took sides against Simonides almost immediately. Tregelles wrote that the story of Simonides was as false and absurd as possible. In response, Simonides defended his argument as published in the Guardian newspaper in September of 1862, where he said, "When about 2 years ago I saw the first facsimiles of Tischendorf, which were put into my hand at Liverpool by Mr. Newton, a friend of Dr. Tregelles, I at once recognized my own work, as I immediately told him." In the book Codex Sinaiticus and the Simonides Affair, author J.K. Elliott confirms that Simonides spoke of his authorship to a man named J.E. Hodgkin in 1860, and in a letter to Sir Thomas Phillips on August 2, 1861. Simonides claimed that the manuscript had not been created with any intention to deceive, but was intended by himself and his uncle as a gift to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. To prove his claims, Simonides challenged Tischendorf to a public debate. Yet Tischendorf refused to take part. About this, Simonides wrote, "The real test of the genuineness of the Codex Sinaiticus is neglected. The public were assured that in May, Tischendorf was to be in London, armed with a portion at least of his great codex. I have waited in England, hoping to have the opportunity of meeting him face to face, to prove him in error. But May has come and gone, and the discoverer has not appeared. Let the favorers of the antiquity of the manuscript persuade him to come at once and brave the ordeal, or else forever hold his peace." Yet despite the evasiveness of Tischendorf, most of the newspapers in England defended him and denounced Simonides as a fraud. The attacks were almost fanatical and often unreasonable. Could Tischendorf's relationship with Rome have had something to do with it? During this same era, Protestant historian J.A. Wiley wrote about the Jesuits' influence in English media. In his book on the Jesuits' morals, maxims, and plots, he said that there are two institutions in especial to which the Jesuits will lay siege. These are the press and the pulpit. The press of Great Britain is already manipulated by them, to an extent of which the public but little dream. The whole English press of the world is supervised, and the word is passed round how writers, speakers, and causes are to be handled, and applause or condemnation dealt out just as it may accord with the interests and wishes of Rome. Yet Simonides was not without his supporters. Another paper, called the Literary Churchman, questioned the antiquity of Codex Sinaiticus and argued that Simonides should be heard. They said, "For ourselves, we must profess entire impartiality. Though we were quite ready, from the first, to admit the importance of the discovery of Tischendorf, we are not prepared at this moment to say with Dr. Trigellus that the statements of Simonides are as false and absurd as possible. Tischendorf applies these terms, false and absurd, just now to Trigellus himself." The reason Tischendorf attacked Trigellus was because he disagreed with him about the writing of Codex Sinaiticus. Trigellus said, "On one point I believe that I differ materially from Tischendorf as to the writing of the manuscript. He thinks that he sees traces of various hands having been employed, in such a way that a change of writer must have frequently taken place. I believe that the difference is to be attributed to the scribe having more or less ink in his style, the ink being more or less thick, and the surface of the vellum slightly varying." In other words, the scribe dips his stylus into an inkwell, and when he first begins to write, there's a lot of ink on it. But sooner or later, the ink runs thin. In places where the ink ran thin, Tischendorf believed that this signified a change of writers, and hence the passage of time. Trigellus, on the other hand, believed that it was the same scribe, it's just that he sometimes ran low on ink. That was the difference. But when you factor in that Tischendorf spreads his scribes and correctors from the 4th century all the way to the 7th century, a span of some 300 years, you're left wondering just how precise the scientific methods were that they employed. Also consider that similar contentions are made about ancient bones that are dug up out of the ground, where the scientists tell us that these are millions of years old and so forth. Do they really have the ability to date bones that way? And did Tischendorf really have the ability to date ancient manuscripts? After the initial attacks against him began, Simonides asserted that these scholars in reality knew little or nothing about ancient manuscripts. In response to one of his critics, he wrote, "Neither you nor Tischendorf possess the true knowledge of paleographical science. You have only learned to say at random, 'This is genuine and this is spurious,' but you do not know the reason." This comment might be brushed aside, but for the often repeated testimony that Simonides exceeded his contemporaries in the expertise of manuscript evidence. James Farrar, in his 1907 book on literary forgeries, wrote that Tischendorf was only the senior of Simonides by 5 years, and in the science of paleography had neither his knowledge nor his experience. Another scholar whose testimony was chiefly regarded was Henry Bradshaw, keeper of manuscripts at the Cambridge University Library. Bradshaw sided with Tischendorf, and once this was known, he was confronted in person by Simonides. In a letter describing the encounter, Bradshaw wrote, "Dr. Simonides wrote to me to convince me and my friends that it was quite possible for him to have written the volume in question. He had invited some of us to Christ College to discuss matters fairly. He could speak and understand English pretty well, but his friend was with him to interpret and explain. They really seemed to believe that all people in the West were as ignorant of Greek as the Greeks are of Latin. But the great question was, how do you satisfy yourselves of the genuineness of any manuscript? I first replied that it was really difficult to define, that it seemed to be more a kind of instinct than anything else. Dr. Simonides and his friend readily caught at this as too much like vague assertion, and they naturally ridiculed any such idea. But I further said that I had lived for 6 years past in the constant, almost daily habit of examining manuscripts. Bradshaw then applied this principle to his opinion of Codex Sinaiticus. When Simonides objected, Bradshaw said, "I told him, as politely as I could, that I was not to be convinced against the evidence of my senses."
So Bradshaw essentially admitted that there was no real scientific proof as to the age of Codex Sinaiticus. And he ultimately admitted that all he trusted in were his senses or his instincts about the manuscript. And Bradshaw is very significant because it was his reputation as a scholar that really compelled people to embrace Tischendorf's Codex.
Bradshaw further said that Dr. Simonides always maintained that the Mount Athos Bible, meaning Codex Sinaiticus, written in 1840 for the Emperor of Russia, was not meant to deceive anyone, that it was Professor Tischendorf's ignorance and inexperience which rendered him so easily deceived where no deception was intended. Mount Athos was the location where Simonides claimed he had created the Codex. He provided many details for how the manuscript had been written and how it came to be at Mount Sinai. He also provided many names of those in the Greek world who he said could confirm that he created the manuscript. But strangely, most of these details were never investigated, either by the supporters of Tischendorf or by the newspapers of the time. In 1907, James Farrar wrote that the controversy cannot be said to have been settled by the mere opinions of Tregelles or Bradshaw, who examined the Codex 2 months before Simonides had made his claim to it as his work, so that they had no reason to examine it with suspicion. But could there have been some other motive that drove the critical scholars at this time? Simonides was a real threat to the academic establishment of Western Europe. If what he claimed was true, it would have shown that Tregelles, Bradshaw, Hort, and Tischendorf knew little or nothing about dating ancient texts. So you can imagine how hard they fought to discredit him. Not only that, but Simonides was working at the time with a man named Joseph Mayer, who was the founder of the Mayer Museum in Liverpool. And while there, Mr. Mayer had him come and examine a series of ancient Egyptian scrolls that he had purchased years before. So Mr. Mayer brings Simonides to the museum, and what he uncovered were first-century fragments and parchments that shattered some of the claims that were being made by the higher critics. He found a first-century fragment of the Gospel of Matthew that was dated within 15 years of the ascension of Christ. And this proved that Matthew was the first gospel, not Mark, and that it was originally written in Greek, not in Hebrew or Aramaic, as the critics had speculated. Also, he displayed a first-century scroll that contained 1 John 5:7, the Johannine comma, which is a hotly disputed verse among higher critics. And this proved that they were wrong, and that the verse was not invented in later centuries as they had been saying. And this was on display at Cambridge University and then at the Royal Society in London. And if you read the accounts, these things were so controversial that some later historians tried to claim that Simonides had sold this scroll of the Gospel of Matthew to Mr. Mayer as some kind of forgery or something. But if you read the newspaper accounts, it's very clear Mr. Mayer acknowledged that, in fact, he had purchased the scroll years before he ever met Konstantin Simonides. So there was a lot of propaganda and false accusation that came against Simonides because these discoveries were so threatening to what the critics wanted to believe. In December of 1862, the London Review wrote that the few believers in Simonides represented him as a man whose towering genius had aroused the envy alike of Grecian professors, German students, and English librarians, and banded them together in a conspiracy to crush him